Hello, everybody. My name is Kyle Dzintars. I am a senior counselor at the SUNY Oswego Counseling Center, and today I will be running a program called Understanding Your Mental Health. The idea is to hopefully fill in some of the gaps because I don't think mental health is as covered as it should be in early education. And while we've created more of a social conversation during the pandemic, I do think it's important that we have ways to self-assess to understand how we are doing and then what to do when we feel a certain way. I wanted to go over some of the resources and then some of just how we understand our own mental health and our mental well-being, especially during this time. So a little bit about me. I am a licensed mental health counselor in the state of New York. I am a certified child-centered play therapist, and this is my second year at the college in the counseling center. And I think it's a really crucial time when people are starting to kind of figure out who they are, understand their identity a little bit more, and doing a lot of exploration to figure out who they want to be after they graduate, as they start careers, and as they continue to grow and develop. So I think this is a crucial time for us to understand our mental health because it will help us to deal with challenges and obstacles in the next steps of our lives. So let's dive into it. I will start with a little disclaimer here. This information is not a replacement for clinical services or therapy. A lot more can be covered in individual counseling sessions or group counseling sessions. This is really solely for educational purposes, helping you to understand what the steps might be, depending on where you're starting from. If you start experiencing a crisis or emergency, please call 911 or go to the nearest emergency room. Sometimes just talking about mental health, we start to experience just triggering emotions, stuff that starts to overwhelm us. So if you start to notice that, if you're attending, take some time, walk away if you need to, see if that makes a difference. And if you're watching a recording, obviously you can hit pause or take a step back. But if you start to feel overwhelmed, I would say reach out to support just so you have someone there to help you through it. Privacy and confidentiality cannot be guaranteed in these kind of Zoom meetings. As far as the recordings, no one else should appear in the recording itself. So I'll do my best on my end to make sure that that is the case. But if anybody asks questions or puts anything in the chat, please just be respectful of that information. It takes a lot for us to share any parts of ourselves in a virtual space like this. So please be respectful in that way. And then please don't record this workshop. I will be recording it and it will be posted in coming weeks so that you'll have access to it again if you miss any of it or if you just want to come back to it. And then if you want to use any of the material that I cover, feel free to reach out to me. I like to be collaborative and kind of piece stuff together, support any of your efforts around campus. I'm happy to share my materials with you. Just send me an email. If you have any additional questions, you can contact our counseling center office at extension 4416. Okay. I won't spend too much time going through this. Feel free to take a screenshot of it if you want the contact information or the ways to best reach us. But we are currently in 202 Hewitt Union. You have our phone number and our website if you're ever interested in specific services we might offer. And then if you do have an Instagram account, I would say to follow us on Instagram because we've been posting a lot more about upcoming events, self-care activities and prompts, and just, nice reminders during the semester. You can also follow our peer educators, the P2Ps, on Instagram at their handle, Oz Peer-to-Peer. And finally, we do have a media and outreach request form. So if you're looking to have something about mental health as a presentation in an event you're doing, in a program you're running for your club, organization, department, anything like that, you could fill out a request form and one of our counselors can be there to support you, either providing you materials or insight leading up to an event or actually being at your event virtually or in person. So just let us know what the details are and we'll get back to you. All right, so this will appear at the end as well. So if you didn't grab a screenshot, that's okay. It'll be the last slide in today's presentation. All right, so our agenda, we're going to cover mental health and mental illness, helping us differentiate what those two terms mean. Sometimes it really misses the complexity of what it means to be mentally healthy or mentally ill. We're going to dissect that a little bit and deconstruct some of the terminology because I think it's more complicated than that. So we'll have some time to dive in. We'll go over levels of need. So not everything requires the same level of need, right? If you are experiencing anxiety about an upcoming test, that might be different than anxiety or stress around a major trauma that's happened in your life. So, what services are available? What providers deal with what levels of need? So, we'll go through some of the criteria for understanding our levels of need. It is subjective. And then some ideas on who to contact or who to reach out to get support if you are struggling in those ways. And then finally, I'll focus on what it's like to be human. Um, I feel like in our mental health field, we do specialize and focus a lot on diagnosis. And we know that some of that creates stigma, right, about what it means to be mentally ill and then what people with mental illness look like or act like. Some of the things that we see a lot in our mainstream culture. I want to focus on humanity because sometimes we experience things that are just what it is to be human, and that doesn't need a diagnosis. It doesn't need to be centralized in that way. Um, Hopefully, this is grounding and normalizing for a lot of you who might be experiencing some of those like human emotional experiences during this pandemic, and hopefully to redirect to either proper supports, appropriate supports who can offer clarity or clarification about diagnosis, or just supports for like what your emotional needs might be. So we'll talk more about that as we get there. Okay, so let's start with mental illness. Mental illnesses are conditions that affect a person's thinking, feeling, mood, behavior, and then oftentimes are categorized by a specific type of diagnosis. So, in the mental health field, we look at different symptoms that arise, what people are dealing with on a regular basis, and then we try and understand it through the lens of what criteria that leads us to a diagnosis. Some of these conditions are occasional, reoccurring, some of them are short term, and then others are long lasting. They might be present throughout our lives. So being able to understand even the duration of what we're experiencing helps us to know what we're dealing with a little bit better. And it is important to recognize that a mental illness is something that does affect our day-to-day functioning, our ability to connect to other people. And that's really what we're going to be looking at is if that's the case, what do we do? Who do we turn to for extra support? So what does mental illness consist of? Um, it's understanding that these kind of conditions impact the way that we go about our daily lives. It might be barriers to things that we are able to do previously. It might be barriers of connecting with people, meeting new people, just being able to feel like grounded and secure in ourselves day to day. So a lot of the time, these kind of mental illnesses will meet this criteria based on the symptoms. And if that's the case, it can lead to a formal diagnosis. Is a formal diagnosis always necessary? No. There's a lot of things that we can do to help take care of our mental health and address mental illness specifically that isn't necessarily clinical. However, sometimes it does help to have this idea or this label, this thing that we can kind of package and understand so that we can find the appropriate treatments. So with mental illness, sometimes it is a short-term mental illness. It could be a temporary experience, something that deals with a transition or an adjustment, grief and loss. Other times it can be more long-term experiences, so more severe mental illnesses, something like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, something along those lines that do affect us maybe long-term. Does it mean that it's going to be the same for everybody all the time? No, there's so much variation. So severity really varies, and that's important to recognize. Not everybody that has a diagnosis of bipolar disorder is going to experience it the same way. So understanding that there are certain severity levels, differences in how we experience it, that's important. And then what causes mental illness? So I feel like we have, as a mental health field, started to understand mental illness very differently in the last few decades. Trauma, I think, is at the core of this. How does our trauma response change the way that our bodies work, change the way that our minds work? So that's something that I think we're exploring a lot more. Genetics, are there certain things that are passed down from generation to generation? Environmental factors. So along the same lines, if it isn't genetically passed down, are there certain behaviors, emotional experiences that we learn from the people around us? Physical health, medical conditions. Sometimes that alters the way that our whole body and mind are working, changes our physiological experiences. Substance use can lead to mental illness, like especially when it comes to coping with mental illness. Sometimes people turn to substance use as a way to deal with some of what they're going through. Nutrition, are there specific deficiencies that are going on that might lead to mental illness experiences? Adjustment transition, which I talked about, and societal factors. So, I mean, we're going through a pandemic. We're experiencing just a lot of, I think, chaos and uncertainty around us, especially in the United States right now, that might cause some disruption with ourselves because we're dealing with increased stress, isolation, all the things that do lead someone to feeling very different than they were previously. And that could meet the criteria for mental illness. So just some basic stats here. About 1 in 5 US adults experience mental illness each year. 1 in 20 US adults experience a serious mental illness each year. 1 in 6 US youth age 6 to 17 experience a mental health disorder each year. 50% of all lifetime mental illness begins by age 14 and 75 by 24. I highlight those last couple stats because I think it's really important as college students to recognize that some of the stuff that's happened before college, leading up to this, might impact the way that you experience the world, might impact the way that you think and feel about what you're going through. So just understanding that it's really important. If we're starting to understand our own mental health, look at your family history. Are there people in your family who have experienced mental illness or mental health struggles, even if it wasn't diagnosed? Because that's going to help you to understand more of the influences and factors that might lead to mental illness, whether it's in yourself or other people in your family. The more information we have to work with, I think the better we can be at attending to mental illness, but also building our own mental health supports. So we'll talk more about that lastly, but just know that during college especially, this is a time to reflect and learn a lot more about what we need to make sure that we are healthy and addressing any mental health illnesses that might have gone unchecked, undiagnosed previously. All right, so on the flip end of this, what is mental health? Mental health also includes our emotional, psychological, and social well-being and affects the way that we think, act, and feel. And so a lot of what our mental health is linked to how we handle stress, how we connect to people, and then what kind of choices are we making to take care of ourselves. So mental health is really looking at it from a different angle, which is what are we doing to make sure that we have like self-preservation, self-care. We are setting ourselves up to physically and emotionally feel okay with what we're doing, what's going on around us. So what does this consist of? There's a lot of different factors. There's a lot of different models for what mental health can be. So I tried to highlight some of the things that do lead us to feeling mentally healthy. When we have meaning and purpose, we have a direction, we know where we're headed, we can grow towards that. That helps us to feel a level of certainty. We have a path. Support and connection. We don't feel alone. Right? We have people who understand, who we can check in with, who will listen and be supportive of us. Safety and security. I mean, this is a big one right now. The less safe and secure we feel, I mean, the more likely it is that we experience very overwhelming emotions, worry, fear, anxiety, stress, frustration. So are we feeling safe and secure? I mean, right now, globally, I would say that that's pretty down. Relationships with our environment. Are we connected with our physical environment, our social environment as well? Do you get along with the people that you're living with? Do you have a good connection with like the natural world around you? Or is it based around destruction? Personal growth. Do you feel connected to what you're doing, and do you feel like it's helping you progress through the world? I think growth is a really important factor in this. We need to feel like what we're doing is continuing to develop. physical health. So are we sleeping well? Are we eating well? Are we feeling rested? That's going to really impact our mental well-being. Coping with challenges. So do we have strategies, tools that help us to deal with stress? Because stress does happen, and that's an obstacle or a challenge that might arise when it comes to our mental health. So do we have what we need to really get through those times? Acceptance of our emotional experiences. Are we able to sit with what we feel and recognize that it's okay to feel what we do? Or are we resistant to that? Are we in denial of it? And then agency and choice, I think, is the core factor here. Do we feel like we can make choices to better our mental health, to better our lives? And if we don't, what does that mean for us? Do we feel like we're stuck? So these are the things that I want you to think about when it comes to the mental health aspects of yourself. Are you taking care of yourself? Do you have some of these factors? Or at least feeling good about some of these factors? Are there places where you can see, all right, well, maybe I need a little bit more sleep because I haven't been feeling rested. Maybe my mental health is suffering in that way. So I really like this model that I found. Sherry Benton created it. I feel like it's very helpful for understanding that it isn't just on one end of the spectrum is mental health and other end of the spectrum is mental illness. It really is more complicated than that, because in some ways, like, we can have a mental illness and have high mental health, right? Like, we might deal with certain symptoms that come up, or we're dealing with transition or change or grief, but we also have things in place to help us feel okay through those. Does it mean that we're never going to feel sad or angry? No, but it's human to feel those things. So mental illness doesn't necessarily relate exactly to mental health. There's different experiences we can have and different quadrants that we might be able to fall into. So I thought this was really helpful for just changing that, getting us out of like the black and white thinking of you're either this or that. We can kind of fall into different realms. So I'll emphasize here that poor mental health doesn't indicate mental illness, right? Like, we go through something that challenges the way that we're feeling or makes us feel like uncertain or unsettled. It makes us feel sad or frustrated. That doesn't automatically make mental illness or meet the criteria for mental illness. It just means that maybe our mental health, the things that we're doing to take care of ourselves, have shifted or changed. And maybe we can adjust what we're doing to help ourselves feel a little bit better by focusing more on our mental health. And I want to stress too that being diagnosed with a mental illness doesn't mean poor mental health, right? There are so many people who have met the criteria, been diagnosed with something like bipolar disorder. It doesn't mean that they don't have good, fulfilling lives just because they have the diagnosis. They can also have very positive mental health and take care of themselves to make sure that they're managing some of these symptoms. Are there going to be ups and downs with that? Of course. I think there are ups and downs with all of our experiences, but just knowing that there is flexibility. It isn't just this or this. We need more of that complexity in this when we are understanding mental health, especially. So I just wanted to clarify that, because I think sometimes it's easy to fall into that way of thinking. In terms of treatment, in 2019, there were about 19.2% of adults who received some form of mental health treatment, which I think is, pretty good, right? Like, we're moving in a direction where people are starting to see the impact of mental health on our well-being. And knowing that there are services and supports out there that can help us to feel better, to get extra care, and especially when we're in need, and to not feel like it's as stigmatized as it once was. So treatment varies so much, and I want that to be emphasized throughout this, especially when we get to the stuff later on. You'll see there are different options for what you're dealing with or what you're struggling with. So some people do just need something like short-term care, short-term counseling. At the counseling center, we do short-term counseling because we work within the semester experiences. Maybe we can't see someone weekly throughout the semester, so maybe we get like 6 or 7 sessions. it doesn't mean that people can't achieve their goals in that time, especially if their goals fit that model. But if someone is working on something that does require a little bit more time, a little bit more specialized care, those are times where we might refer to someone in the community who can offer consistent weekly sessions or who is specialized in a specific treatment. So just know that there are differences in the services that are provided. Not every provider can work with every possible experience that someone has gone through. And just know that there is a wide spectrum of providers out there. So sometimes people need medication intervention too if they're unable to get to a place of just feeling somewhat grounded or stable. Medication can be incredibly helpful at those times, just for helping someone to get to a place where they can start to do some of the therapeutic work. Some need group therapy. I know that's somewhat of an intimidating factor in this, or treatment in this. But people that I have experienced like group experiences have had some of the best outcomes that I've heard, just because you don't have to feel alone in it. Um, there's so many people that can probably relate to what you've gone through. And if you're in a situation or a space where we can talk through that and not feel like we're the only one who understands, I think that is so relieving. It helps us to just feel connected to someone else who gets it. So don't write off group. It's very helpful. And then some need specific therapy approaches. So if you're working with a trauma specialist, if you're working with someone who specializes in a specific diagnosis, sometimes that can be very helpful. Some need psychoeducation. Some of our outreach, like this, for example, programs that help us to understand things a little bit differently, hopefully. They can be what we need to start understanding ourselves a little bit better, making small, subtle changes that help us to feel better. And then sometimes we just need someone to listen. I do not underestimate the power of having a good listener in your life. That makes a huge difference. So try and pinpoint who that person might be in your life and see if talking to them is helpful. Doesn't necessarily require counseling or therapy to get some support. So how do we know what we need? Because that, I think, is a barrier for a lot of people when it comes to seeking out services. So much like your physical health, right? Like when you stub a toe, for example, do you need to go to the hospital? Do you need surgery? Do you need to work with a specialist? Similarly, when you're stressed about an upcoming test, does that mean that you need counseling services? I would say in both circumstances, we're going to look at the severity of the pain, whether that's physical or emotional pain, right? So you stub your toe and it has split open. That's going to be different than you stub your toe and it's going to bruise. The same with stress. Are you stressed and still able to take the test and do okay through it? Or are you so stressed about the test that you don't even go to the test, that you don't even get out of bed the next day? Those are very different experiences. So knowing the level of severity of the emotional pain, I think, is going to be key to understanding what we need at those times. So let's go through some of the examples here. I'll preface this by saying not everybody will agree with what I've constituted as mild, moderate, and crisis, because it is very different for us depending on what we've gone through. So, for example, test anxiety, that could fall in any of those categories depending on your experience of that anxiety. So, no, this is a model and a guideline. I would highly recommend making your own list of this. What does it look like when you're in a mild level of need? What does it look like when you're in a moderate level of need? What does it look like when you are in crisis? That's going to be way more helpful than some of the examples I can give here. I just wanted to give a template for you to follow along with. So some examples that I would say typically would fall in that realm of mild. Having trouble getting some of the work done. Maybe you have a little bit of stress coming up about a test. Procrastinating. You just find yourself like not being able to focus on things. Friendship or relationship struggles. You had a fight with a friend. Loneliness, right? We're at increased loneliness. Maybe that's getting to you. Slight changes in mood. You notice that you're sadder, more down than you usually would be. And then feelings of overwhelmed. So usually those are like the starting feelings of feeling overwhelmed, right? When you start to get like a headache and you're like, oh, there's so much to do. What do you do when you're experiencing mild? Here's a list of resources to start with. There's way more. Campus is full of them. You can probably come up with your own that you might not even be connected with the school specifically. But again, your own list is going to be the most valuable as we build this. So maybe talking to a friend or family member, maybe that does it for you. You just need to vent. You just need to say what's going on and have somebody understand it. Maybe the Office of Learning Services, they can offer some tips on how to get through test anxiety, how to deal with like the stress of trying to do time management and the stress of studying, things like that. They might be able to give you some information or help have you work with somebody who can help you learn some of those skills. Laker life is great if you're feeling isolated. Maybe find a club or an organization to try out. The counseling center offers Let's Talk. So it isn't a counseling service, it is a consultation service. Our counselors offer these times. We're virtual for the time being. You don't need an appointment. You can show up and you can just talk about whatever is going on for you. I've had a lot of people who are going through like roommate trouble. They might log on to Let's Talk and just say, oh, this is really hard to go through right now. I never have time alone. I don't really get along with my roommate. I just need to talk about it. So it doesn't have to be this major issue in your life. You don't have to be incredibly affected by it, but it's a good place to just talk to somebody who's outside the situation. Our peer educators also offer their own. So they are undergrad students. They are not trained in counseling. They don't have their degrees yet. They might be working toward it, but they're just your peers. So maybe showing up to these drop-in hours where you're able to just talk to somebody who gets it, right? Like they might know what it's like to be a student in the certain classes that you're in or dealing with certain dilemmas that you are. Maybe it's a good space to just go and talk about it and see if anybody else can relate or ask questions about the counseling center. And then some of these things I think are independent. So like writing or being creative of some kind, that can really help us process what we're going through. And then especially like yoga, meditation, any of those kind of practices, exercise, all of that stuff can be really helpful for alleviating some of those feelings and emotional overwhelm. I'd recommend 7 Cups of Tea. It's a great app. It's free. They have a lot of prompts. They have a texting service where you can text with an active listener. And then they also offer counseling services, which I think is in their paid category. So if you want to stick to the free stuff, there's still some great resources in there. And then for classwork, I would recommend the tutoring center if you want to work with somebody who can help alleviate class stress, or the writing center if you're struggling with getting papers done or having to write certain things. So just some ideas for those mild situations, things when there's an issue, but it's not overwhelming. You're still able to like function. So the next category here, we have moderate level of need. So this is where things start to increase in severity. It could be like maybe you're rarely going to class. Maybe you're not even like attending classes. You've had a lot of absences, or you just can't even get yourself to like sign on to some of your virtual classes. Overwhelming anxiety, right? So maybe it's just hard to even like leave your room. Maybe it's hard to talk about something that's going on. Noticeable increases and decreases in sleeping or eating. So you are sleeping straight through the day. You're not even getting up. Or on the flip end of that, like you can't go to sleep. You're starting to feel like you never feel like you're in rest mode. You're up late night thinking. You wake up in the middle of the night and you can't go back to sleep. And then the same for eating. Are you eating a lot more than you're used to? Are you eating way less than you're used to? Sometimes those are indicators that we're in need of something. We're experiencing something overwhelming. Are we isolating more than usual? I would say we're in a pandemic, so probably in general anyway. Is that getting to you? Is it hard to be by yourself all the time? Or is it hard to reach out to people when you are feeling overwhelmed? If you notice any of the emotional overwhelm happening, so maybe increased crying, just feeling so angry, just devastated or worried, anxious, any large changes in our mood, anything that's more dramatic than we're used to feeling. we're neglecting our self-care. We're not even doing anything, or we can't get ourselves to do anything that's good for us. And then we're starting to struggle with like our hygiene. Maybe we're not showering as much. Maybe we're not brushing our teeth. Maybe it's just like hard to keep up with all that stuff. The dishes are piling up. And then any increased alcohol or drug use, a lot of the time that's masking something that's underlying. So has that been used in order to feel differently, to avoid feeling anxious or depressed or sad? Are we turning to substances to help kind of get out of that feeling? And then what do we do when we are experiencing that? I would say this is probably the level where I would recommend counseling services, where you can start to work maybe one-on-one with somebody specifically, to help kind of facilitate those changes. What do you need to talk about or figure out for yourself to help get out of some of these negative patterns or these cycles that might be happening? The health center might be really helpful too. If some of these might be medical issues, are there certain things that are going on physically that you really need checked out? Sometimes, like we know that sometimes medical conditions lead to increased anxiety or depression. So maybe it helps to just check in with a health specialist, primary care doctor. Accessibility services. So maybe you're struggling a lot in classes. You don't understand why. That might be a good place to look to see, are there extra resources that I can benefit from that will help ease some of the pressure of those experiences? Dean of Students Office is a good place to look for resources about health education, about alcohol and substance use. And I think just to get some support from the campus itself. They have a lot of resources that you can access. They have peer educators that you can talk to. So another good place to look. Thriving Campus or Psychology Today. Those are two off-campus mental health service provider searches you can do. So Thriving Campus, we actually work closely with. They have created an easy way for students to see what services are available to them, either in their local area of Oswego or wherever they're living. There's a lot more providers who have been added to it recently, so you might be able to get hooked up with a therapist in your area. Psychology Today is also across the US, and you can find providers in different states. And then finally, we have an off-campus mental health provider list that you can find on our website. So if you're interested in having any more service providers or just checking out who's available for you, that would be a good place to look. We've tried to pinpoint therapists who might work really well with students of color, students who are in the LGBTQ plus community, or just who specialize in specific needs of an individual. So I would say check that out if you're looking for other ideas to find a provider outside of us. And then finally, crisis level. So this is the extreme end of this spectrum. This is when a person is either safe, unsafe, they're unable to communicate what's going on. They cannot handle emotionally what they're going through, and they might not even know what they're going through. So some factors to look for, are they able to communicate, or do they have like this inability or difficulty communicating what's going on? Are they having anger outbursts or violence? Sometimes punching things or throwing things is a symptom of that as well, that someone's in like really increased pain, crisis. Threats of harming self or others. So this could be self-harm, this could be suicidal ideation, this could be homicidal ideation. So are they making kind of threats either to themselves or other people? Extreme substance use. So this is like consistent blacking out, using substances at a very increased, maybe scary, dangerous amount. Are they just under the influence most of the time? Inability to attend to basic needs. So that stuff is out the window. They're not really able to take care of much else. They might not be grounded in reality. So if you're talking to someone, or if you kind of observe someone, or you're starting to feel yourself, that you just don't feel connected to what's going on around you. Might be auditory or visual hallucinations. It might just be like this out of body experience. You don't really feel like what's happening is real to you or to others. And then finally, suicide attempts. So if someone is at that level where, they moved beyond threat, and they've actually tried to kill themselves, that would constitute a crisis. That's someone in high need of some kind of support or intervention. So what do we do when we know ourselves we're experiencing this, or others that we care about are experiencing this? And so Counseling Services Center is a good place to look to help get crisis support. We have what we're calling rapid access during this remote time, so they can get hooked up with a counselor immediately. A lot of times I've seen students will come in because they just don't know what else to do. They're at their breaking point. So you don't have to have an appointment set up. You can call and you'll get connected with a crisis counselor right then and there. And then if it's after hours, because we do have business hours, you can call the office still. You'll be connected to our main line. And then if you select option 2, you'll be hooked up with a crisis counselor who can talk to you over the phone, and they'll be able to run through some of your options for making sure you're safe. And then if it's gotten to the extreme version where there's imminent danger, either self or others, I would recommend calling university police if it's on campus. They can respond quickly to the situation, or some kind of emergency services that might be calling 911 to make sure that someone's coming to check on somebody, or going straight to the ER. Because sometimes we do need a level of intervention to ensure our own safety. And if that's the case, reach out, because those services are set up for those specific situations. So that's on the extreme end, when things have gotten to the worst they can get, and people are really struggling. So just to summarize all of that before I dive into being human here, try and understand your own tiers. Like, what works for you? What's helpful for you? What are the barriers that get in the way of us taking care of our mental health? Or is there anything that we really need to know about mental illness to help inform ourselves the most? I said before, family history, personal experiences, all that stuff is really important to track. What could potentially lead to mental illness? What's going on for ourselves that might influence the way that we think and feel and behave? And then mental health wise, what are we doing to make sure that we're best taken care of? Are we making sure that we get our rest? Are we making sure that we're eating okay? Are we making sure that we're not overwhelmed with activities and stress and things to keep up with? Do we need a mental health day? Things like that. So if you create your tiers that match your specific needs, that's going to be the most helpful for you, because you're going to be able to say, all right, right now I'm going through this moderate thing. I know that I can reach out to counseling services. I know that I can reach out to a friend or whatever. That's going to be way more helpful than even some of the ideas that I've presented here. So make it your own. So the last part that I want to focus on here is this idea of being human. So being human is complicated. We are a lot of different things, and it fluctuates throughout our lives. There are probably times where you can think you might have been more confident and more connected to people, and there are times where you've been like really disconnected, really sad, really upset. So understanding that like being human is okay. We don't have to be this ideal self where we're feeling like perfect all the time, or like we're always happy. We can be different things, and that is okay. So I think the starting point of this is this idea of self-acceptance. Like, what we think and what we feel is okay right now. Can we accept that that's the truth? That is what we are going through. Because sometimes it's the denial part, it's the rejection of what we are experiencing that leads to it worsening. So let's start with acceptance. And part of this that I want to explore is some of the things that help us to avoid over stigmatizing human experiences. Sometimes we look for diagnosis to be the end all be all, but there is a difference in how we experience things and what that means for us. So I would say taking time for yourself is a really important place to sit with what you're experiencing. Can you be by yourself alone and totally undistracted? Or do you have this kind of desire to escape that feeling or that situation? We live in a world where those distractions are so accessible. You might always have your phone right next to you. You could easily pick it up and start scrolling. You might always have like a TV in front of you where you could put some show on. There's always these kind of distractions. But what does it feel like when you are just sitting in your quiet aloneness? Can you be okay? Can you feel okay through that? Or is that really hard? Look at what shaped you. I said this before already, but knowing your family history is important. And then also accepting that the things that we've gone through in our lives oftentimes do impact the way that we feel, right? If you had like very harsh friendships growing up, maybe that really took a toll on your self confidence. And that makes it hard for you to feel okay or grounded with the friends that you have now. Um, Maybe you experienced trauma that you just didn't deal with at the time because you didn't understand it as trauma. You didn't really know what to do with it. Maybe that stuff is resurfacing. So, what can we learn about ourselves and what we've been through? And I'd recommend mapping your inner world. Um, the basic way, and I know this is going to sound somewhat like common sense, but we don't do this for ourselves, and we aren't asked to do it for ourselves very often. But what do you physically feel when you're having an emotional response, and where do you feel it? Right. So, like, I might say something like, oh, I'm so anxious right now. That could mean any number of things. Do I feel anxiety in my chest? Is it my like racing heart? Do I feel anxiety in my head? Like it's just these constant thoughts. Do I feel anxiety in my jaw because it's like tense? I'm holding it. What does it feel like when you feel a certain way? I would say if you focus on negative experiences, which people tend to do, right? So, like anxiety, sadness, frustration, also try and capture those other feelings, the good stuff. What does joy feel like? What does excitement feel like? What does calm feel like? Try and capture both sides of that spectrum as well. And then noticing where you feel it is so important because when we know where we feel it, we can make different choices to help ourselves self soothe. What are your warning signs? So, for example, like I said, jaw, maybe I realize that when my jaw muscle starts to hurt, that's a warning sign. That's you're holding a lot of tension, a lot of stress. What can you take off your plate? What can you say no to? How can you make small adjustments? But you have to be attentive to those warning signs to catch them. Maybe your warning sign is that you can't shut off at night. So you check your email, you are trying to do work late into the night. Maybe that's a warning sign that you are dealing with too much and you need to take care of yourself in a different way. And then finally, when do you feel your calmest? Do you have space in your schedule for just calm relaxation, for rest? Because if not, that is something that I think really impacts our emotional well being, our physical well being. So make time for rest as much as it's difficult because there's so much to do. If you aren't rested, you are pushing your body to its limits. And then assess your hopes, your goals, and direction. I know a lot of people like vision boards because it helps give us like an actual visual of where we're headed. But you can do this in any way that's meaningful for you, whether that's writing or creating. But just understand where you're headed. Feel connected to something. And it might not be a long way down the road, right? You might not know for sure what you want to do for a career. Maybe your goals are focused on this semester. I want to make a new friend, or I want to do really well in this class and see how I feel. I want to try at this. I want to join something. What are those goals and what are they helping you to do? And then continue to learn. Always be curious about yourself. Is there more that you are taking for granted? Because that will help you so much to be curious. A little bit about self-compassion here. We're in a pandemic. Being patient with yourself might not be easy because I know I felt this myself. When you see people staying busy and productive and doing so much, it's easy to say like, well, why can't I do that? Why am I struggling so much? And I'd say that it probably is because we're assuming people are handling this better than they might actually be. Especially in isolation, it's easy to make those mistakes. So just know that however you're dealing with this is okay. That is perfectly okay to be dealing with it the way you are. Maybe we are not the person that we were before this pandemic started. And maybe we do need that self-acceptance of who we are now, because that's going to help us to deal with reality and the truth instead of trying to live up to this maybe false image of what we think things should be. So being patient with yourself is saying, yeah, I recognize that I have ups and downs and I can make mistakes and it sucks, but that's okay. Like, it's okay. I'm human. Notice especially how you would talk to a friend who was going through what you are experiencing now, right? So, like, for example, you are procrastinating. You're finding yourself like not able to get your work done. You're falling behind. And maybe your inner chatter is like super negative, right? Like you're so hard on yourself. Like, why can't you do this? Like, what is wrong with you? I'm going to fail, blah, 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 blah. If your best friend, maybe a family member, was going through the exact same thing, what would you say to them? How would you treat them? And then does that align with how you treat yourself? My hunch is it's very easy to be more negative to yourself than it is to other people. So I will emphasize this a lot. You deserve the same kindness and compassion that you give to other people. You are just as worthy of that. So in those private conversations with yourself, be there for yourself. Be supportive of yourself. Plays into the next one here. Stop bullying yourself. Notice if you are spending a lot of time berating yourself for like not getting something done or saying something wrong or doing something that you feel like embarrassed or shameful of. You spend the most time with yourself. I think it's important to make a healthy relationship in that space, because if you are just returning to your home, your apartment, your bed with yourself, and it's a bullying, toxic relationship, then you're heading into these situations that don't set you up for success. They set you up to feel bad and negative about yourself. So work on making a healthy relationship with that inner self. Don't let the inner critic lead the way. And then avoid the trap that often happens, right? So like when I'm talking about self-compassion, being nice to yourself, I've heard from a lot of people like, yeah, but if I do that, then I'm just gonna never succeed at anything. I'm never gonna like actually do the stuff that I want to do. And I don't think that's true. I would argue back against that, because I think like sometimes when we actually are doing the things that we feel good about doing, we don't need to bully ourselves into it. And you can think of probably small examples of this. Maybe it's a video game you really like playing where you're like, I'm enjoying this. Maybe it's talking with friends or creating like an event or something for a lot of people to show up to, pre-COVID, obviously. Those things that give us joy that we do without the obligation or feeling like it's a requirement, those things show us that we are very capable of doing things when we feel good, right? Like joy motivates us, purpose motivates us. So going easy on yourself is really working with the truth. It is saying, this is a hard time, and I can see that you are struggling, and that is okay. We can get through this. When you support yourself, you're more likely to turn that stuff into joy and purpose. The more you bully yourself, the more requirement, more obligation you feel. And I think that makes it harder to do those things. So when you see what you have to do as connected to your long-term goals, I think you'll start to feel a connection and you'll feel proud of what you're able to accomplish. Even if you didn't want to do it, you know that it's leading you towards something that feels good and that you'll be proud of. So try and reframe that a little bit. Then finally, communication. So because your story matters, all of our stories matter, they make a difference. Sharing what you're going through is so important so that you don't feel alone in this. We talked a little bit about group counseling already. What else helps us to feel connected, or where else can we feel connected to share those stories? I know for some, talking about stuff is hard. It's very overwhelming to tell your story to someone, whether that's in counseling, whether that's to a stranger, whether that's to a friend. So if talking is too much, start with self-expression of any kind. That could be keeping a journal for yourself. That could be writing prompts. That could be painting, doodling, making music, electronic music, playing a guitar, singing. That could be finding metaphors that fit a little bit better for what we're experiencing so that we're not like revealing the details of it. Explore how to express what you're feeling. Um, I think it has to come out. We just have to feel comfortable with what's coming out for that process to start. Maybe talking isn't the first step. Find a good audience or supportive listener. So start with your friends, your family member. Who makes you feel the most comfortable? Who is the most supportive person that you can turn to? And if you are struggling to find those connections right now, I mean, counselors are a good place to start. We're trained listeners, we're trained in support, we're trained to help other people learn more about themselves. So it is a good space to get that feeling, to know what it's like to feel listened to and understood. If you are struggling to find that support, that's a good space to try. Either Let's Talk or counseling services would fit that. So give it a shot. And then try a little bit at a time. So if you are building up the courage to share some of what you've gone through, try it in small amounts. It doesn't have to be the whole thing at once. It doesn't have to be these like massive disclosures of everything that you've gone through. It can be those small moments. Just telling a friend that like, yeah, your parents were divorced too, or telling a friend that you've been to a counselor or therapy before, telling a friend that you know what depression feels like. You're not revealing these major, massive parts of yourself, but that can be really helpful in building a connection. Maybe they won't feel so alone because they're experiencing something similar. Maybe you won't feel so alone because you know that somebody else has gone through it. And then finally, know when to walk away. If you start to get overwhelmed, if you start to feel like you're shutting down in your communication, maybe it's a good time to take a walk, separate yourself, come back to it when you're ready. Recognize those inner feelings and emotional experiences, and then try your best to listen to your body, listen to your needs so that you're making those choices. You don't have to force yourself through these emotional experiences. Learn to trust yourself because your body's telling you something, and maybe that's a helpful thing to listen to. So to wrap up, because that's a lot of information, a lot of stuff to process, here's all of our counseling services info. So if you want to get connected, we still have openings, and we're doing a lot of outreach. Let's Talk is going on throughout the semester. So there's a lot of ways that you can reach us and check in with yourself. So if any of this stuff brought up a lot for you, emotional experiences, you started like thinking about things in different ways, maybe it is a good time to check in with somebody. The pandemic is a very stressful experience. If you are struggling with mental illness or with keeping up your mental health, maybe it is a good time to look for the supports that could be best useful for you. I always say start with Let's Talk because I think it's a good place to try. But if you know that individual counseling is where you can get your needs met, like call us, get an appointment set up. Also, I would recommend checking out our groups on the Counseling Center website. We're offering a bunch this semester. We have some that are drop-ins, so you don't need to be committed to it, and then others that do require a commitment. It meets for like 6 or 8 weeks or something. So we try and encourage people to be at all those meetings. So you can follow us on Instagram to keep up with everything. And then any announcements, self-care ideas, you'll be tied to that on your social media accounts as well. So if you have any questions, let me know. I'll stick around to answer some. If you want to reach out to me, you can just check on the Counseling Center website to find my contact information, or leave a comment in our Mindful Oz account. You can do that as well. Respond to a post if you have questions about anything that we're posting or anything that's coming up. I just appreciate you being here, taking the time to listen and check in with your mental health for this semester. And I do hope that you are doing what you can to maintain that during this. because it's not easy. I think a lot of people on campus are struggling, and the more we talk about it, the more we relate to each other about it. I think that the better it'll be. So make sure that you are making time for yourself and check out some of our self-care programs. I know they're not as ideal as we'd like them to be because they have to be virtual, but might be helpful if you're struggling. So thank you again for being here. I'm going to stop the recording, and then if anybody has questions, just let me know. All right, take care.